Welcome back to the Ink Sink. I am Annie.
And I'm Kaylee.
This is the publishing podcast for the rest of us. We are covering books and news and writing and reading, and today we're getting academic with it.
That's right.
We're deep into our dark academia roots, I feel.
Yeah, it's time to get our cardigans on. Actually, it was quite warm in here, so I just took my cardigan off.
It is.
So today we're talking about...
Today we are talking about the scholarly publishing crisis, which we have so many thoughts on. We've been itching to talk about this.
There are a lot of issues that have probably been building for a while and would say that they're all about equally at crisis point right now.
100%. I mean, it's like... We talked a little bit about how, like, libraries have to deal with microcosms of everything going on in the world. And this is just another one of those. I feel like we get really meta in this podcast, and this is almost more meta because we're going, like, we talk articles about writing articles, books about books, like, news about news, and we're, like, going even deeper into, like, journals about journals.
Journals about the issues with journals.
Right! It's crazy. There are studies in journals about the issues of journal publishing.
And the issues with studies in journals.
It's crazy.
That is accurate. It is
every now and then I feel like we've gone a little bit far down the rabbit hole, but I feel like this is important to talk about because it affects, like, the public knowledge.
Oh, it does. And I feel
which is important.
It's also relatively recently been in the public eye because of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. We talked a little bit about that on the show before, about the preprints, and we're going to talk more about that today. And whether there may or may not have been a debunked ivermectin article on a preprint server that got a lot of attention.
Yeah, there were multiple. Like, that's just it, though. I mean, it came up, like, multiple times where people would put out something on a preprint server. It would get roundly shat on, and they would retract it. But by that point,
right,
it was out in the world, and somebody had taken it and run with it. And whether or not, like, so obviously there's already, hateful things happening in the world, but, like, people take that and make it worse.
And there's not a lot of oversight, and especially, like, I've never lived through a pandemic before. I was freaked out and didn't know what to do. I'm sure journalists felt the same, and so they're citing these debunked articles, not knowing that, number one, that they're preprints, and number two, that they're gone.
And trying to just get information out to the public because everybody's scared, and it's
an emergency. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything you want to say before we jump in?
No, this was a very interesting topic, and apparently it's been a long time building. Yeah. Which is how we got to crisis points.
Yeah. So today we are jumping into the scholarly publishing crisis, which is probably what you would rather Google than, like, journal publishing crisis, because there is a journal out there on crises, and it does get published, so Google gets very confused if you try to...
Yeah, a lot of these terms are, like, the most generic terms, and so, like, trying to
vague.
look up certain journals or publications to make sure they're legit,
it's
not helpful.
It's horrible.
Thanks, academic publishing.
Thanks, Google. So I'm going to get started, I think, with the history, just so that we can get a little bit of context. So obviously I'm not going to go all the way back to, like, the printing press, but academics and universities have always produced their own research because that's just what they do. Like, a lot of times what they're doing is studying these things and distilling what they've studied into something new and then building upon that. So there have been academic journals for a really long time, and with the rise of things like historical societies or poetry societies or local societies focused on, the geography or geology of a location, those societies also publish journals. And at first, it seems like in the, early 1900s, it was pretty straightforward, right? Someone would do some research on a topic and then go to a journal that was related to that topic, or they were funded by this society, and they would go back to the journal and say, here's all the research that I did. And the society would, take a look at it, review it, and then publish it and say, here is our entry into the public record on this topic. Cool. Awesome. Perfect.
Back when time moved slower.
Yeah, exactly. Back when they were mailed out to people and printed on a printing press.
And everybody had time in their day.
Yeah, to read about the geology of, I don't know, northern Wisconsin or something. And then capitalism showed up. This was around the
villain of every story.
It's so annoying. I was like, I wanted it to be something different, but it was genuinely just consolidation and capitalism. So these large publishing companies took a look at the business model of these journals, and the business model is genuinely pretty good. So the geology of northern Wisconsin, which is apparently just the example that I've decided is the most important, and I don't even know if that's a real journal, is very static. Like, you're not going to get a lot of competition in that space. There's only the one journal. And if anything important is happening there, it's going to be published in this one journal, and anyone who is interested is going to be subscribed to this one journal. And they are not going to stop subscribing. Ever, basically, because it's not like there's ever going to be another alternative. So, it's a very inelastic asset, which in economics is very, very good, because that means that you can raise the price and no one will get mad. You can see where this is going. So publishers, capitalist publishers in about the 1960s and 70s kind of took notice of this. I'm saying capitalist publishers, I just mean popular publishers, companies that had been in the magazine publishing business and were looking to expand. Today, that's things like Wiley and Elsevier. So they started scooping up these journals because they saw the economics and were like, this is a good thing. And maybe consolidation would be better because, we can consolidate some of this administration stuff. So it's lower costs and higher profits. And they raised prices triple digits, unfortunately, especially in biosciences and the hard sciences like physics and nature. Now, liberal arts is a little bit different, which is where we usually focus. So we've been kind of insulated because sounds really weird, but liberal arts aren't as popular as other sciences.
I mean, I feel like you shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
We get shat on a lot by the sciences.
Yeah, so we were a little bit insulated. A lot of liberal arts journals were able to stay independent, but because of the changing economics of the market, they also raised their prices by triple digits. Journals as a whole, academic journals, society journals, have risen in price 100, 200, 300%. Meanwhile, inflation over the same time period has only gone up 60 to 70%. So we can clearly see that this is not a cost issue. This is an economics of demand issue. So these journals just keep going up, and unfortunately, they are still going up. Kaylee, you did some research farther in like the early aughts, I believe, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it was so interesting because like there were roughly 4 digits, the number of like scholarly scientific journals in say 2003-ish, and then it ballooned an extra like 26,000 roughly. So I was actually reading an article by the National Institute of Health. And if you were curious, because I bring this up later, this is pointing out that one of the bigger issues, and it's something that we have talked about a little bit, is relating to the sheer volume of content that is being required.
Right.
Publish or perish. This was actually a term that was coined in 1932 by Coolidge, which I can actually look up a little more.
And while Kaylee is doing that, I'll give a little bit more context. So as these journals kind of became more important, a lot of times you'll see, there's a new study talking about this on the news. Basically, usually news sources are only subscribed to 3 or 4 journals. And so anything that comes out of those journals will almost automatically get news attention, especially if it's like a huge deal. Academics, as in universities, started requiring professors to publish in these journals in order to prove that they were doing professorly work. And as Kaylee said, it came to be known as the publish or perish model. The only way to get tenure, which is, the way to make money as a teacher, is to publish a lot of scholarly articles. But because everyone is trying to publish these scholarly articles, the number of journals who are seeing this as a market has just exploded. So these poor teachers who are stuck having to do this are really in like this never-ending treadmill because they're trying to publish their work. They're trying to get their work noticed, but so is everybody else. And because the university system is expanding at the same time, it's like a million things. So Kaylee's going to jump into the academic side.
I had my numbers like super off. I apologize. So the person that initially coined, or at least the first attributable source that we have for that publish or perish quote, is in 1932, Archibald Cary Coolidge, Life and Letters by Harold Jefferson Coolidge. So it's attributed to Archibald Coolidge.
Mm-hmm.
In relation to the publishing industry. So it would have been prior to the 30s where like it's already, the pressure's already on. And then you come to about 100 years later, just under that. And we've got, 16,000, not 1,600. I think that's what I had implied. So there were 16,000 in 2000, journals.
In 2001. Wow.
And then it jumped up to 23,750 by 2006.
Wow.
So this that's a really massive jump.
And that's very much a function of the supply of articles, of research, of studies being so high.
And it's a matter of like being expected to publish to prove your worth as an academic or in your field, while also doing, I just want to be clear, whatever job you were hired to do.
Right.
So as a professor or instructor at a university, although there are universities that do hire researchers specifically, but like for the most part, a lot of the research that is being published by people that are also teaching, or they're being published by people that are doing a different job, but that they have to be able to avoid stagnation in their career, publish and put out this content to stand out enough in their field to let themselves be seen and heard. Well, that really hurts not only the quality of their other jobs, but also the quality of their publishing. It takes time to do this research. It takes time to collect the data. It takes time to analyze that data. Then you have to put it through a peer review cycle. And then we come to the preprints and getting the reviews, and how quickly is that possible? Where does this come from? Is the feedback valid? So like there are so many issues today with the sheer volume of content, and it's just, Annie is not wrong. Like, capitalism is just, I swear to God, like, anytime you see something and you're like, oh, that can't be capitalism. It's definitely capitalism in a trench coat with a mustache. Like, it's probably capitalism's fault. It's so frustrating because it really is an issue, and I just don't know how to fix it. I mean, and that's where we're all at right now. That's like where so many people are at. Like, how do you resolve that? I mean, we've had so many people point out the fact that this is not sustainable.
It's not at all.
So we had previously discussed in one of our other episodes, we were talking about the Sokol hoax back in the day. So we had talked about the Sokol hoax in context of just absolute nonsense being published. And it seemed to be like a prank. In this case, it was genuinely nonsense. Like, it would be like just random paragraphs about like somebody's day after the first intro, or 2 paragraphs in, or like row, row, row your boat, or whatever it was. Whereas there was actually a team of 3 scholars like that specifically went in and published absurd papers. Like, they were content, but it was like the research was deeply flawed and problematic, intentionally, that was supposed to be caught. And at the time that the paper was published, in this case, I'm sorry, let me actually introduce what I'm talking about. This is an article from The Atlantic that was published in 2018. So at the time that this was published, these scholars had 20 fake papers that they had sent around to various respectable journals over the course of a year. So between like 2016 to 2018, in the year period, 7 of them had been published. And they were in the liberal space, so like this wasn't the most critical like aspect of constant content. Again, everywhere's been affected, but some areas worse than others for sure. And it was just absolutely like astonishing, like issues that were present in this. So if you're curious about this, obviously we will link to it. But the reporter in question that wrote the paper on this for The Atlantic is Yasha Munk. Hopefully I said that last name correctly, Mounk. that is one of the problems today, in my opinion, and it's something that we have previously discussed with publishing in general, especially with the recent pandemic, is that people don't always trust these sources anymore. And like, who do you trust? And then, at that point you kind of give up and you're like, well, I guess I'll just trust my Aunt Patty and her, I don't know, bunion. Or whatever, like whoever you see on Facebook. Or
how Aunt Patty talks to her bunion?
Like, what are you gonna do? And so, like, we had so many issues. When we were talking about this previously, like, even people that are not being intentionally hurtful or harmful, there's a reason that the peer review process should be occurring, and it should be rigorous. Like, the overall timeline for getting a journal, like getting research published, it's long, and it should be long. If you do your research, you can collect data, you have that reviewed, and then you put it to a journal, and it gets rejected, then you should be going back and taking the feedback as to whatever reason they rejected it and redoing your review process. Like, you have to then undergo review again and then make sure that your data still holds up and like you've answered or filled these holes and then you've resolved whatever the issue is. The turnaround time that is being required of these scholars and academics and professors, the researchers, is insane. And it's causing them to just push this through, and it's causing the journals to be unable to support and sustain, like, the sheer volume of content that they're being forced to look through. They're not able to support and sustain the quality reviews that they're required to do. And we talked about that before. That's how this garbage gets in. And people that, like, journals that intend to produce quality content and do otherwise work with very prestigious people and places can still end up, publishing a paper about gender bias in dog behavior at a dog park. It's just absurd.
Which was a hoax.
Yes. Just to be clear, this was one of the hoax articles that I was talking about.
Yeah. So let's jump in. Normally I try not to go too deep into the particulars and technicals and practicalities of how publishing works, just because it gets very boring very quickly. But I think we have to for this. So I'm going to outline what an ideal journal publishing process looks like.
Yeah, the timeline is wild.
Yeah. So step one is the proposal. The researcher, whether it's a professor at a university or a grad student, they decide what they would like to research, and they send out those proposals to grants, because research costs money to do. You have to pay the participants who you're researching. You have to pay for samples. You have to pay for space, and all these things. There's tons of things that you have to pay for, and you have to pay for documentation, pay for of even other types of research. So they are sending out proposals to these funding sources. Sometimes it's to the university that they're working for. Sometimes it's to that local, Northern Wisconsin Geology Society. Watch that be real, and we're just besmirching the Northern Wisconsin Geology Society. Anyway, so they're sending that out, and sometimes they're sending it out to state and local grants or federal grants. They're looking for money. So they've made a decision about what they want to research, but they need money to do that. And a lot of times, the people who support that research may have caveats. So that's your first issue, is the funding bias, which is why all funding should be disclosed in scholarly research. Ideally, it is. Sometimes it's not, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then the research gets done. Now, a lot of people have issues with the study of statistics. We're not going to get into that either. But basically, everyone involved needs to be able to meaningfully analyze any results of what they're doing. And if it's a liberal arts thing, a lot of times what we're talking about is criticism. Strictly analyzing the criticism that you're getting is also extremely important in being able to root cause any biases or data points that this critic is talking about. There's a dog licking my foot. I apologize if you can hear it. This is just what she does. So, all of the research is getting done. Step 3 is compiling and reporting on that research. This is when those actual studies or reports or works get written up. Now, hopefully, these reports are getting, reviewed by an editor where they are being produced, but not
Fingers
all the time.
crossed, yeah.
And then step 5 is sending that report into a journal. Now, at this point, usually you're being pressured by whoever's giving you funding to get this in. A lot of times, the funding that you've got has to go to the journal, or a part of it to go to the journal in order to print the thing. Yes, authors do have to pay to get their journals or to get their articles printed, which is so not how it works in any other type of publishing. And then the journal will receive it. They'll accept or reject it based on the topic. And you can absolutely send your article elsewhere if the journal rejects it. But if they accept it, it will then go to peer review. The journal will look through its stable of peer reviewers and send it to them for review. Step 5 is those peer reviewers actually going through it. This is usually, if it's a good journal, anonymous. They don't know who is writing.
Usually it's a double-blind anonymous.
Yeah. They don't know who's writing, and then the whoever's writing doesn't know who the reviewer is. So then the edited step 6 is that the edited work comes back and then goes back to the author to address any issues. Step 7 is publication. Now, this is all idealized. This is how it's supposed to work.
But then you get to the real world where everybody's got to eat.
Right. So again, these authors oftentimes are paying these journals to publish them, which means that there is a heavy incentive for the journals to just take those articles and push them out there, take the money, and walk away. That is what we would call a predatory publisher. A lot of publishers, will say, oh, it's not predatory if you're clear that we'll just publish anything. And in my opinion, it still is predatory.
It's predatory.
Because these authors are heavily incentivized to send these things out. They need to get published in order to keep their jobs. So that's a problem. And then there is a kind of like little sub-step in when authors are sending their work to the journals to be peer-reviewed. They are also sometimes posting it on a preprint site for very urgent things like COVID research or other types of health research. It can be very important to get the health research out there as soon as possible. But remember, these haven't been peer-reviewed yet. They haven't been reproduced yet. They haven't been confirmed. So what you're getting is basically a first draft of science. And a lot of times, what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic is that journalists or other concerned citizens are accessing these servers and not realizing what they're looking at is not necessarily proven science yet. So that can be a problem.
And not only, and again, we're talking about people that are operating in good faith.
Right.
Even people that don't necessarily draw conclusions you would agree with. Anybody that's posting to these sites typically can be assumed that they're trying to operate in good faith.
Right.
Or working with people that are trying to operate in good faith. But
Yeah.
if the consuming public accesses this information and takes it as read, then that's when problems happen. And we saw that during the pandemic, and we've seen that. I mean, it's deeply hurtful. Like, we've seen harm that has triggered from articles that suggested that the COVID-19 was created in a lab, basically, and it's pulled from these journal articles that suggest that it was engineered, and those articles were very quickly pulled because the research wasn't supported, but the damage had been done. Mm-hmm. And people that were already upset were now felt like that they were justified.
Right. It's a problem. And so this is a problem for the public, of course, but it's also a problem for pretty much everyone else involved.
Yeah, that is the truth.
The authors are, again, like a lot of times mid-career professionals doing their best to just keep their jobs. Mm-hmm. And when they sign over a article to a journal, they lose the copyright to that article. They can't cite their own articles.
Oh, yeah. So, speaking of availability, like,
right,
off of Bookseller, there was a specific, opinion comment post that was put out. So Bookseller has a different terminology for these things. An author with a PhD in human rights, mm-hmm. Who had been published by Al Jazeera and MIT Tech Review, he was just basically saying, like, this is one of the biggest issues right now that we're facing because I can publish, but it's still being lost. Journal articles only have a shelf life of about 5 years before their data starts to degrade.
Right.
And they have to be revised.
It stops
and
being
revisited.
relevant.
Yeah. So like if you can't access your article isn't being distributed in your community, like that's a problem.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry,
No, I'm with you. Yeah. No, you're right.
As you were saying, access it's such a massive issue right now.
And one of the other issues that if an author wants to post their own articles,
they can't.
They can't.
They could be sued.
Right. They could be sued by
the publisher.
These journal publishing companies. And as Kaylee said, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. But a lot of them are actually owned by just a couple companies. Things like, again, Elsevier and Wiley. And there's just like this huge backlash against these companies because of their horrible practices. Again, they're making money from the authors. They're also making money from people who have to pay to get these journals. And they're making massive amounts of money from libraries who have to pay to maintain their subscriptions to these journals. Every year, those costs are going up. And again, most libraries, we talk about this all the time, libraries bear the brunt of a lot of problems. But most libraries are publicly funded. Those are your tax dollars that Elsevier is holding on to because they can. Because they can. They've raised prices 300% because they can. There's a, this theory in economics that the prices will go as high as the market will bear, but that only works in an actually free market. This is not a free market because they don't have a choice. There's no choice for journals. The authors have to publish in the journals. The journals have to be published in the libraries, and they have to be published available to, and then the authors have to pay for those journals to do more research to then publish again in those journals. There is no free market here. It is absolutely a problem.
And that's why stuff like Sci-Hub exists. And that's why it's not the only answer, but like thank God like that people have actually taken steps and there's like 2 major hubs right now that are available. They're not the only answer because they're, again, just archives more than anything.
Right.
Specifically, I'm talking about Sci-Hub, but like that's in general. But that is the method through which many academic journalists are moving because they have to. Because they need access to the research to be able to continue doing their own research.
I saw a really good quote actually in my grad school Discord, and I'm going to read it to you. Does anyone else feel like scholarly publishing is like when in Animal Crossing, Tom Nook forces you to buy a house to be part of the community, and then he makes you work to earn money to eventually pay him to live in the house he just forced you to buy? I'm like, that's perfect. That's absolutely what it is.
Yeah.
It's a problem. So what are our solutions, Kaylee? Let's talk about solutions so that we can end this on a good note.
That's fair. So in the article that the opinion piece on Bookseller, just to confirm, that was by Rafael Zvako Garcia. So he's a Brazilian journalist, and he's the one that had like his article published in a place where he couldn't access his college couldn't access it, his community couldn't access it. So his suggestion is we move to not-for-profit status, which again, a lot of our issues are traced back to a not very well disguised capitalism villain just wearing a face mask that says it's a money sign. Not-for-profit that works with universities, and we kind of move back to before a lot of our industries were privatized. Go figure. I'm not saying that everything has to be nonprofit. Like, sure, have your for-profit, publishers and content creators, but like, there should be some protection for the academics and for the sciences because there's not a real sustainable way to support, I think, the research and the rigorous requirements to review that research and the volume of work that is required to get through an academic cycle today. And
that's another thing I didn't really pay attention to or focus on when I was going through all the problems is the peer review. So peer review is free. The people who are reviewing those works are not getting paid to do it. They're volunteers. And a lot of times it's based on how much time you have. And again, a lot of these people are also academics doing all of these other things. Some of them don't have the time to do this. And then they'll, get taken off peer review rotation. So they don't know what's going on. Well, one of the benefits that the peer review gives them is that they're able to see what's going on at the cutting edge of their field. But, not all peer reviewers are able to sit down and take the time to reproduce results, to think critically about the work that they're looking at. So that can become a problem as well. And then the journal will almost by necessity go to people who are going to be faster, but
whether they're going to be as
less
good
of a look at it. Yeah. And then, and as we were talking about earlier, some of those predatory journals don't have reviews at all. They just take what you send them and publish it. And then you can say, hey, I published. But was it in a quality journal? Was it with any quality? Was there any review to say, yes, your study or your information was correct? No. So it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory.
It's awful because in some of these journals are like trying to present this as like a win or whatever. They're like,
right.
Or they'll publish and then review.
Right.
And it's not good. Like no matter what you say on your, however you disclaim your presentation of the information, somebody will misunderstand.
Mm-hmm.
Even on these these pre-print sites where that's all they are, people
right.
misunderstood.
Right.
If you're actually publishing content. So there's a particular journal, and I'll try to figure out which link I was reading this in, called eLife, which has moved to this model entirely, and it's in my opinion, one of the predatory publishers because it's publishing and then reviewing. That's the problem.
It feels like a no-win situation because on the one hand, if you just like keep gatekeeping all this information, no one gets it. But on the other hand, if you just put it out there, people misunderstand what they're seeing in some cases. There is a huge push for open access to fix some of these problems and just have the funding for the research be what props up not only the research, but also the journals. But that comes with its own set of issues. I know you did some research on that.
So, yeah. Okay. So we just talked about. So like eLife has decided to move entirely to a model in which it makes its research available, but pre-review entirely. It is basically, it's been published on a preprint site and then it'll take that and publish it with the understanding that it has not been through the review process yet. As long as it's available for review, it's like fine.
They're essentially showing early results, first draft which I already said, but like I feel like we need to keep banging on this because it is not great. Like whose first draft is good? You know what I mean?
And when you're talking about, this was specifically something that, again, we saw during the pandemic, which was an issue, like recently, where everybody's like remembering all of these things with like the various like miracle cures or whatever, which didn't work and actively endangered many people. But like specifically, there's a journal that was specifically to the COVID, rapid response COVID-19, that was about these preprints that were actively being published. Like they were being presented. So I'm like, not only do you have like people going to the site and misunderstanding, now you have this entirely new presentation of data that's been published. Mm-hmm. So you could be somebody that's trying to do your due diligence and not go to a preprint site for this final information, and then you get fucked anyway because this information is being presented as published content that has been posted for review. Right. Like it's just such a shady way of getting around people like actively like looking at your journal for like actual solid facts that have been proven.
And again, like based on timing, like COVID-19 was an emergency. Am I mad that more medical knowledge was getting out there quickly? No, but am I mad that a lot of it was shitty? Yeah. I feel like researchers also have an ethical responsibility to do good research and to hold back when you don't know if what you've done is good. And maybe, this was a case of like people being like, oh, I'm positive it's great. Go for it. But maybe it's just that I wish that everybody would slow down for a second and think about what you're doing and do better. But there are a couple other initiatives. A lot of scholarly publishing advisories will tell authors to try and hold on to some of their copyright so that they are able to
pull their
own content, but also engage more fully with the journal when it's trying to publish their stuff, and also, be able to cite your own work later on. That's a big thing. Open access, I think, is super helpful, obviously, as someone who doesn't super like paying for research.
Or have the ability to, yeah.
I get most of my research through our city library has access to the Gale database, which is one of those bundles that we were talking about. So it gets a lot of, scientific journals. I also have Scribd, which has a lot of scientific journals. And through grad school, I have access to JSTOR, which also has a lot of scientific journals. So I'm very lucky right now that I'm in a location with a library that gives me all of this, and then also going to school at a library that gives me all of this. But otherwise, I'm also having to pay for these bundles. And when I'm trying to do research, that becomes a problem. If you are someone who's like, I don't really know what you're talking about, most of the research I do, I just like type it into Google or into Google Scholar. Google Scholar, by the way, is google.com/scholar. And you can and it'll essentially take your Google search, and instead of applying it to just the entire internet, it'll just look at scholarly articles. Highly recommend. A lot of them are open access, but again,
not all of them.
Make sure, not all of them, yes, but also make sure that what you're looking at is a peer-reviewed article if you want the best science, or make sure that what you're looking at, or that you are, whatever you're doing, keeping in mind, if it's not a peer-reviewed article, that it is in fact not reviewed, that it is just someone's first draft. And first draft is probably too harsh. It's probably a second draft, because the first draft was probably something that they presented to their colleagues. But still, I mean, it's still not a final is the main thing that I want to get across here. But the peer review process, again, doesn't protect you always because of those hoaxes that we talked about. Some of them did go through full peer review and still were not caught. Mm-hmm. So a lot of researchers are also making the point that, there is no, it seems, silver bullet. Open access isn't necessarily the answer, because then you can get just a lot of drivel, and then you have to sort through that, and databases are already problematic to sort through. Peer review also isn't always the answer, because it really depends on the quality of the peer reviewer.
So I do want to speak to that, actually.
Please do, yeah.
So the Institute of Physics Publishing, aka IOPP, is moving to a full double-blind, 100% double-blind anonymous peer review. So it's not just yes, there are people that are trying these not great, in my opinion, publish then review sort of deals, but
sure. And again, these are all our opinions.
Yeah, obviously, but traditional methods are still being supported in many of the industry and in many of the industry leaders and such. But the IOPP is acknowledged. One of the things that many authors have said is timing, access to markets, access to publication speed, all of that is a matter of who they apply to, the speed at which a journal can peer review. And that would take, some of these people would not apply to the eLife journal, like I said, because it doesn't actually give them a guaranteed review prior to publishing. So Mark Gillett was the head of publishing operations at IOPP, and he said that we consistently hear back from authors that the speed of peer review is one of the top things that they pay attention to when considering which journals to submit to. So they've actually started putting together a certification program to support researchers in peer review.
Oh, that's
to
a good
actually
idea.
help them learn things, tools to help them peer review better, but still get that diverse pool of peer reviewers available to their content.
Yeah.
So I just think that's so interesting that we also have acknowledging that we need these people. Mm-hmm. Let's give them the tools, and maybe that'll make it easier for them to be able to come back, because then you're not trying to figure things out from scratch, because there are different methods of proposing and supporting and providing your information in the different industries and fields. How do I read a medical journal versus how am I reading this mathematical proof versus how am I reading this liberal arts cultural evaluation of this subculture within my city or whatever. They're very different approaches consistently, even when they're standardized.
Right.
So
yeah, there
you
was
can't just do one or the other.
Recently there was a study in Shakespeare Quarterly about whiteness in Shakespeare, and I can absolutely see a peer reviewer for literally anything else being I am not qualified to jump into this. So you need to have literally a peer. You need to make sure that the person who is reviewing the thing is in any way able to do so. Yeah.
And so that way people that are coming in saying, I want to peer review, can say, I can peer review these things.
Actually, I'm saying that off the top of my head. It might have been a book review, but for example, something like that, if it had been a research article, it would have been very it would have been a very specific type of person who even could peer review.
Yeah, so like you need to come in, like if you want to make your time efficient, like don't have somebody floundering at anything and just clicking randomly or whatever, or have like, especially if you've got like an assignment sort of system in your company or your journal,
Right.
like make it efficient if you can be, because you need to find where you can improve this, respond to the issues that we've discussed, and the
Right.
timing issues that we've discussed, and the volume issues that we've discussed, without necessarily retracting your quality standards. So
yeah,
I just thought that was interesting that they're like trying to find a way to make it easier for people to know how to peer review.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, I'm going to be looking into that program. I'm just curious.
Please do keep us updated.
We'll do.
And if you're wondering how on earth does all this academic mamby-pamby apply to you? Well, again, tax dollars. A lot of these research initiatives that these researchers are doing is publicly funded in some way. The federal government does a lot of funding for research. Public universities fund a lot of research, which comes from your tax dollars. State and local governments fund a lot of research, which again comes from your tax dollars. And then the libraries have to buy those said journals, which is also coming from your tax dollars.
With your tax dollars.
So this is something that you are paying for almost, I mean, it's kind of indirect, but it's almost directly, and you are paying these inflated costs when in fact you should not be, because if you're paying for the research, you shouldn't have to be paying to access the research, or if you're paying to access the research, you shouldn't be paying for the research itself. Like, it really should be one or the other, but unfortunately you, dear American, are paying for both.
You get to pay
Sad
for
face.
it all. And that's, again, this is a very American specific and centered discussion. We are American and this is what we are familiar with. Anybody that has a wider access that somehow is listening to this podcast, please, if you have any frame of reference that you'd like us to research or look into, send us your info.
Yeah, absolutely.
And any scholarly research on the topic.
The other way that it affects normal people is that this is how your doctor is making decisions for your care based on the latest research.
And based on what
out.
they have access and time to consume of the latest research. Yeah.
Exactly. This is how your kid's teacher is choosing how to teach your kid is based on the latest research in early childhood education. This is how, there's some like esoteric mathematical and physics research, but that's what's eventually going to be studied in schools. This is how city planners are planning cities around you. This is the stuff of life. And obviously Kaylee and I, or if I can speak for both of us, are both, obviously very academically inclined. And so we very much think that this is extremely, extremely important. This is how engineers are figuring out how to make your car go faster. This is the people who are figuring out how to store solar energy into the latest batteries. These are
ethical ways to improve creating these batteries.
These are the benchmarks, the basis for those advancements. And if they don't have any support, or they don't have any review, or they don't have any way to get out there and be seen by the people who can use them, or if it's just shitty work going out there that's just wrong, that will affect you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but absolutely down the line. So
it could cost you a lot.
Right. And in the meantime, it's all costing you a ton of money.
It's already costing you money.
Yeah.
And it will continue to cost you money.
So we find this really, really important, and we're going to keep up with this. If you are really interested in this, you should follow us on Twitter, because that is where a lot of academics are posting their issues with.
And you'll know if everything shifts to Tumblr.
Yeah, well, that too. And also I will retweet a lot of their stuff so you can see in real time what's going on and the issues that people are having. Do you have a Kaylee Coda for us today, Kaylee?
I mean, it's just like sad that just the breakneck speed that like these people are required to work with, and the lack of support is just so tragic. Just I don't know, just be kind. Be kind to the people that are trying to do their best by you and themselves and their families. That's all I can say.
Thanks for listening to the Ink Sync. I'm Annie.
I'm Kaylee.
You can follow us on pretty much any social media platform except for Tumblr. And you can support us on Spotify and Anchor. And if you are interested in books by trans authors, you can check out our bookshop and support our trans authors.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abby.
Thanks, Abby.
I'll see you next time.